Hello, my name is Mick Moore and I am a research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies at the University of Sussex. I want to introduce you to a new book just published called Taxation and State Building in Developing Countries. And this book essentially explains why and how taxation can bring about good government. I'm one of the authors of this book, and I'm going to introduce you in sequence to a number of the other authors who are going to tell you something about it. They are Professor Deborah Brautigam, Dr. Anuradha Joshi, and Professor Joseph Ai.
It was interesting to us to find out how many different ways this relationship worked, this taxation and citizenship worked. Things that we found out, for example, who would have expected that in a small country like Mauritius, the export tax would actually serve as a way for the private sector and the exporters of sugar to interact more effectively with the government. They use the export tax to build a strong association of sugar exporters, and then they could bargain with the government, not just about taxes, but about the kinds of policies that the government would have for the sugar sector, the kinds of inputs that the government would put into research, and that also gave them the ability. There are several problems in things like agriculture. It's hard to do research because if you do research as an individual agricultural company, someone else can appropriate that or someone else can take the benefits from that and you pay for all the costs. But if all of the sugar producers together agree to put in a little bit to pay for the research, which is what they do with the tax, and it's almost an involuntary thing, but they agreed to do it amongst themselves, then this can pay to build up their capacity to be better sugar producers. So we wouldn't expect that taxation would actually serve that kind of function.
Thank you.
Another intriguing thing in the book is the story of the informal sector. In developing countries, you don't have a very large formal business sector, and it's really business taxes or income taxes that provide most of the bulk of revenues in rich countries. But in developing countries, this is not the case. You're usually looking to find most of your revenues in things like trade taxes or maybe value-added taxes. This is increasingly the case. But in countries that have a very large informal sector, people that are doing petty trading on the streets and the small markets and so on, people that are outside of the tax net usually, this is really where the government's revenues are going to have to start to come from. And so we see some creative ways that governments and small informal sector associations have come together to try to solve this problem. And one of the chapters in the book discusses this in some detail.
Anuradha, we're talking about associational taxation. Could you please tell us what you mean by that term?
Well, we've used this word associational taxation to describe an arrangement in which governments who are finding it difficult to tax the informal sector can do so by using informal sector associations that know their members better in a tax relationship.
Can you give us any examples?
Yes, we very much found this sort of associational taxation in Ghana, where the government was using the association of bus drivers, trotro owners, taxi drivers to collect income taxes from their members.
Okay, so this is the people who run the buses?
Yes, the people who run the buses, the public transport.
Okay. You talked earlier about the informal sector. What do you actually mean by the informal sector?
There's no one definition of the informal sector, but in practice it's basically businesses that are operating outside formal systems. In other words, those that are not registered with the government in any sense. They usually don't pay taxes, and also they don't usually follow employment, labor laws, etc.
Why does it matter if government's not raising taxes from these people?
Well, it's obvious to almost any casual observer that the informal sector in developing countries is growing enormously. You find people on the streets selling small vegetables or other sorts of things. You find businesses operating in informal settlements, low-income settlements, and it's growing enormously. So if the government wants to raise revenue from all its citizens, it's really important to tax the informal sector as well, because it's growing. There are other reasons for taxing the informal sector as well. Research has found that the formal sector taxation increases if the informal sector is small, or in other words, formal sector businesses find it unfair and are not willing to pay taxes if the informal sector is also not being taxed.
Okay, so it's a matter of fairness.
Yes, it's a matter of fairness. There's also the whole question of legitimacy within the informal sector. If the informal sector forms a large proportion of the businesses in any developing country, then the government starts to lose legitimacy. And one way of increasing legitimacy is to go in and make some constructive engagement with the sector. The sector itself is actually not adverse to being taxed. Research has found that businesses often operate within the informal sector not because they necessarily don't want to pay taxes, but they want to avoid the onerous regulations that happen to exist.
Joseph, the Ghana Private Road Transport Union it's a business association, but they're collecting taxes. Could you tell us why this is an unusual and rather special arrangement?
I think the unusual or the uniqueness of the role of the union in collecting taxes that, for once in the history of tax collection in Ghana, we have a way of collecting taxes from associations, drivers associations, hairdressers associations, butchers association. And I think the uniqueness of the GPRTU or the union is that it started first in 1988. It started in approaching of government, and government decided that it would be able to farm out tax collection to the union. And out of that, with that model, with the success in the union model, other associations, other drivers associations also joined. And then, of course, we had the other associations, tailors, butchers, beauticians, and hairdressers, also collecting taxes on behalf of the government and, of course, collecting a commission.
I think the message of the book is that taxation builds states, but it also builds citizens. And without that central relationship, the tax, the citizen, the state, you're going to have weaker states, and you're going to have weaker accountability, and you're going to have less of a relationship of representation. And so while nobody wants to pay taxes, and nobody wants to pay high taxes, that bargaining relationship between governments and citizens comes about at that point. So taxation is central. It's not just central for academics looking at the relationships in developing countries. It's central as a relationship between citizens and states. So it's not something we have to love, but it's something we need to understand, and it's something that's interesting.